The sound of the heavy leather suitcase latch snapping shut echoed through the high-ceilinged library like a gunshot, signaling the end of a decade. Brianna stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a ghost against the rain-streaked Manhattan skyline. Julian did not even look up from the mahogany desk where he sat, his posture as rigid and unyielding as the empire they had built together. "It's a generous settlement, Brianna," Julian said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once promised her a lifetime. He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished surface with a clinical detachedness. "The penthouse is yours for the next 30 days, and the bank accounts have been partitioned. Think of it as a severance package, compensation for your time and services." A sharp, melodic giggle cut through the mounting tension. Skye Addison emerged from the shadows of the wet bar, her sequins catching the dim light as she moved with a predatory, youthful grace. She draped herself over the back of Julian's chair, her manicured fingers twisting a lock of his hair with possessive ease. "Severance? Oh, Julian, you're far too sweet," Skye purred, her eyes fixed on Brianna with a look of bored triumph. "Most men would have just changed the locks and let the lawyers handle the messy parts. You're lucky he's so sentimental, Brianna. At your age, starting over is such a daunting prospect." Brianna felt the words like a physical blow to her chest, more painful than the divorce papers themselves. She looked at Julian, searching for any trace of the man who had once whispered that she was the brain to his brawn, the strategist who had turned his fledgling startup into a global conglomerate while he was still learning how to wear a suit. But his eyes were empty, fixed on the ledger in front of him, as if she were nothing more than a depreciated asset. "My age." Brianna's voice was steady, despite the cold fury beginning to coil in her stomach. "I am 32, Julian. We spent 10 years in the trenches together. You didn't build this empire alone. And I'm grateful," Julian interrupted, finally meeting her gaze with a look of chilling indifference. "But Skye brings a certain vitality to the Reeves brand that we need for the IPO. She's the face of the future. You're a legacy asset, Brianna. And in this market, it's time for a write-off." Skye's laughter rang out again, a mocking sound that grated against the silence of the room. "Don't take it personally, honey. It's just an upgrade. Take your check and go buy yourself a quiet life somewhere far away from the city. Maybe a garden." Julian's pen never hesitated. He signed the final document with a cold, clinical flourish, the scratching of the nib on paper sounding like the final nail in their marriage. As he handed the papers over, Brianna realized that he truly believed he was discarding a piece of his past. He had no idea he was throwing away the only person who knew exactly where the foundations of his world were buried. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind Brianna, but it could not drown out the sound of Skye's tinkling, triumphant laughter. The thick envelope Julian had called a severance package felt like lead in her hand, a mocking weight that represented 10 years of her life reduced to a line item. She stumbled through the dimly lit hallway of the mansion she had decorated, past the curated art she had selected, and toward the grand staircase. Her vision blurred with the hot, stinging heat of tears she refused to let fall. She was a ghost in her own home, a legacy asset, being liquidated to make room for a newer, shinier model. The cold fury coiling in her chest was eclipsed only by the sheer, agonizing humiliation of it all. Julian hadn't just broken her heart. He had attempted to strip her of her dignity, treating her as if she were a mid-level manager being laid off rather than the woman who had paved his way to the top. She turned the corner blindly, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the marble floor, her only thought to flee before she completely fell apart. But as she rounded the bend toward the foyer, she collided with a wall of solid, unyielding muscle. Strong hands immediately reached out, gripping her upper arms to steady her. The contact was firm, grounded, and startlingly cold. Brianna gasped, her head snapping up as she prepared an apology, but the words died in her throat. She looked up into the face of a man who seemed to have been carved from obsidian and silk. He was tall, his presence so commanding that the air in the vast hallway suddenly felt thin. He wore a black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with lethal precision, and his features were a masterclass in stern, sharp-edged handsomeness. His eyes were dark, intense, and impossibly focused, looking not just at her, but through her, as if he could see the very architecture of her soul. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Reeves?" His voice was a low, resonant rasp, carrying a subtle, dangerous weight that made Brianna's heart hammer against her ribs. He didn't pull his hands away. Instead, his thumb brushed almost imperceptibly against the silk of her sleeve. I'm sorry," Brianna stammered, trying to regain her footing. "I wasn't looking. I was just—" "You were fleeing," the man interrupted smoothly. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the cream-colored envelope clutched in her hand, then back to her tear-streaked face. A slight, predatory smile touched his lips, one that didn't reach his eyes. "A woman like you should never have to run from anything, especially not from a man who is about to lose everything." Brianna froze. "Who are you? I didn't see you on the guest list for the celebration." "The guest list is for those who seek Julian's favor," the man said, his voice dropping an octave. "I am here because I seek his debt. I am Lee Dong-hwan." The name hit Brianna like a physical shock. She had heard whispers of the name in the highest echelons of the city's power brokers, not as a businessman, but as a legend. Lee Dong-hwan was the man behind the shadows, the ruthless head of a global syndicate that operated in the gray areas, where Julian only dreamed of treading. "You're the one they call the one Julian is currently terrified of," Dong-hwan finished for her. He let go of her arms but remained standing close, his aura of authority wrapping around her like a shroud. "I've been watching you for a long time, Brianna. Not as Julian's wife, but as the strategist who turned a failing startup into a billion-dollar empire while he took the credit. I've watched your brilliance be wasted on a man who values sequins over substance." He stepped closer, his scent, something expensive, clean, like cedar and cold rain, filling her senses. "Julian thinks $1 million is enough to buy your silence," Dong-hwan continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I think your brilliance is worth a kingdom. I have a proposition for you, Brianna. Marry me instead. I will give you the resources to dismantle Julian's world piece by piece. I don't want a trophy, and I don't want a legacy asset. I want a partner who knows how to win. And in exchange, I will make Julian Reeves realize that when he dumped you, he signed his own death warrant." Brianna stared at him, her breath hitching. The madness of the offer was intoxicating. She looked at the envelope in her hand, the price of her disposal, and then back at the man offering her a throne. For the first time that night, the coldness in her chest began to burn with a new, lethal fire. The rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lee Dong-hwan's Tribeca penthouse, a stark, glass-and-steel fortress that stood in silent defiance of the city below. Brianna sat on the edge of a deep charcoal velvet sofa, the silence of the room so heavy it felt tangible. She had expected to be ushered into a bedroom, or perhaps a formal dining room where more hollow promises would be exchanged. Instead, Dong-hwan had led her directly into his study, a room that smelled of expensive tobacco, aged paper, and the cold, ozone scent of the storm. He didn't offer her a drink. He didn't offer her comfort. Instead, he walked toward a massive desk carved from a single slab of obsidian and tapped a sequence into a recessed panel. A series of monitors flickered to life along the far wall, displaying a dizzying array of scrolling numbers, shipping manifests, and encrypted communication logs. It was a digital ghost, a manifestation of an empire that Julian Reeves hadn't even known existed. "You spent 10 years as the ghostwriter for Julian's success," Dong-hwan said, his back to her as he surveyed the data. "You found the loopholes. You navigated the regulatory minefields. You turned his clumsy aggression into surgical precision. And yet, he thinks he discarded a housewife." He turned then, the light from the screens casting sharp, dramatic shadows across the planes of his face. He held a leather-bound tablet, the ledger, and set it on the table in front of her. "I have no interest in a trophy wife, Brianna. My world is filled with beautiful women who can play the part of a consort. What I lack is a mind that can see the patterns in the chaos before I do." Brianna looked down at the tablet. It wasn't a list of names or hits. It was a complex map of Julian's primary holdings, specifically the logistics arm of Reeves International that was currently being prepared for the IPO. She saw the vulnerabilities immediately: the over-leveraged debt in the Southeast Asian sectors, the shaky contracts with the port authorities that Julian had assumed were ironclad. "He's planning the acquisition of the Holloway Group next Tuesday," Brianna said softly, her eyes scanning the data with a familiarity that felt like a long-lost language. "He thinks the Holloway portfolio will mask the debt he's hiding in the logistics division." "And?" Dong-hwan prompted, his voice a low, encouraging rasp. "And he's walking into a trap," Brianna continued, her voice gaining strength as the strategist within her woke from her grief-induced slumber. "Holloway isn't selling because they're struggling. They're selling because they've already been gutted from the inside by a silent partner. If Julian signs that deal, he isn't acquiring an asset. He's acquiring a black hole that will swallow his liquid capital in 6 months." She looked up, her gaze meeting Dong-hwan's dark, unblinking eyes. "You're the silent partner. You've been feeding him the Holloway deal for months." A ghost of a smile touched Dong-hwan's lips, one that held no warmth, only a deep, predatory satisfaction. "I provided the bait. I waited to see if Julian was smart enough to see the hook. He wasn't. But you saw it in under 30 seconds. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with an aura of absolute power. Julian discarded the only person who could have saved him from me. He thinks Skye Addison's youth and social media presence will win over the board. He doesn't realize that in the world I inhabit, a face for the future is a liability. Only the mind matters." He leaned down, his hands resting on the back of the sofa on either side of her, effectively caging her in. "The marriage is the theater, Brianna. It is the distraction that will keep Julian and the rest of the world looking at the emerald gown and the diamonds while you and I dismantle him from the inside. I am giving you my name, my resources, and my protection. In exchange, I want your mind. I want you to be the general of my legitimate front while I handle the shadows." Brianna felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of a dark, intoxicating thrill. For 10 years, she had been the secret weapon Julian kept hidden in a gilded cage. Now, the most dangerous man she had ever met was asking her to step out of the shadows and sharpen her blade. "You want to use me as a weapon," she whispered. "I want to give a weapon back to the woman who forgot she was holding one," Dong-hwan corrected. He reached out, his fingers brushing the underside of her jaw, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Julian gave you a severance package. I am giving you a war. Do we have an agreement, Brianna?" She looked at the ledger, then back at the man who was offering her a chance to set her old life on fire. The good girl, who had tolerated Julian's slights and Skye's insults, died in that moment. "We have an agreement," she said, her voice like cold steel. The fountain pen was heavy, a cold cylinder of obsidian and gold that felt more like a scepter than a writing utensil. It rested on the desk between them, a silent invitation to finalize the most dangerous merger of Brianna's life. The marriage certificate didn't look like the ivory parchment she had signed 10 years ago in a sun-drenched chapel. This was a crisp, clinical document laid out on Lee Dong-hwan's desk, appearing more like a declaration of war than a union of souls. Dong-hwan stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the gray morning light. He didn't press her. He didn't offer a platitude about new beginnings. He simply waited, his presence a constant, low-frequency hum of power that filled the room. Brianna looked down at the line designated for her signature. For a decade, she had been Brianna Reeves, a name she had helped build into a symbol of corporate prestige. Now, that name was a phantom, a legacy asset that had been liquidated by the man who wore it. To sign this paper was to bury that woman forever. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool barrel of the pen. She thought of Julian's dismissive smirk. She thought of Skye Addison's mocking laughter. Most of all, she thought of the severance package currently sitting in a trash can in the foyer. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, Brianna gripped the pen. The nib touched the paper with a faint, decisive scratch. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name, watching the ink bleed into the fibers, officially binding her fate to the man standing in the shadows. As she finished the final stroke, she realized she hadn't just signed a marriage license. She had signed a death warrant for the woman who had allowed herself to be played for a fool. "It is done," she said, her voice sounding different to her own ears, sharper, colder. Dong-hwan turned from the window. He walked toward the desk with a slow, deliberate grace, picking up the document as if he were inspecting a hard-won territory. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in his dark eyes, approval, or perhaps the satisfaction of a general who had finally secured his most valuable asset. "You are no longer a guest in this house, Brianna," he said, his voice a low rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. "You are a Lee, and in my world, that name is a shield. It is also a weapon." He tapped a button on the obsidian desk. A moment later, the double doors of the study swung open. Brianna turned, her breath catching in her throat. A line of 6 men stood in the hallway, dressed in identical charcoal suits that did little to hide the coiled lethality of their frames. They stood with military precision, their expressions masked in professional indifference, but their eyes were sharp, scanning the room with predatory efficiency. At the head of the group stood a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow and an aura of stillness that was even more terrifying than the men behind him. "This is Marcus," Dong-hwan said, gesturing to the man with the scar. "He is the head of your personal security detail. From this moment forward, you do not move without them. They are your shadow. They are your fist. Their only purpose is to ensure that no one, not Julian, not his lawyers, and certainly not his new vitality, ever breathes the same air as you without my permission." Marcus stepped forward, bowing deeply to Brianna. "It is an honor, Mrs. Lee. We are at your disposal." The weight of the title, Mrs. Lee, settled over her like a suit of armor. Brianna looked at the men, realizing that Julian's security had always just been a pair of off-duty cops hired for appearances at gala events. These men were different. They were an army. They were the physical manifestation of the darkness Dong-hwan had promised to wrap around her. She stood up, smoothing the skirt of her dress. The fear that had lived in the pit of her stomach since the previous night was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. She looked at Marcus, then back at Dong-hwan. "Julian is meeting with the board at noon," Brianna said, her mind already moving 2 steps ahead. "He'll be trying to sell them on the Holloway merger. He thinks he's safe because he's in his own boardroom." Dong-hwan's eyes darkened with a predatory light. "He thinks he owns the room because his name is on the door. He's forgotten that I own the building. I want him to see them," Brianna said, gesturing toward her new guards. "I want him to see exactly what kind of upgrade I've made." Dong-hwan walked toward her, stopping only when he was inches away. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive, lingering touch. "You're learning, Brianna. The theater of power is just as important as the power itself. Marcus, prepare the cars. My wife wishes to make a social call." As Brianna walked out of the study, flanked by her army of shadows, she felt the last remnants of the good girl fall away. She wasn't just a strategist anymore. She was a Lee, and the world was about to find out exactly what that meant. The walk-in closet of the Tribeca penthouse was not a room for clothes. It was an armory of silk, lace, and tempered steel. Brianna stood in the center of the vast, mirrored space, surrounded by a team of 4 women who moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a surgical unit. They didn't speak to her. They worked upon her, their hands cool and professional as they stripped away the last physical remnants of the woman Julian Reeves had discarded. On the floor sat a discarded pile of cashmere and beige, the housewife, uniform she had worn to blend into the background of Julian's life. Those clothes were designed to be invisible, to signal a woman who was supportive, soft, and secondary. One of the stylists nudged the pile aside with the toe of a pointed heel as if it were contaminated waste. Brianna didn't look back at it. That woman had died the moment the obsidian pen touched the marriage contract. The skin must be luminous, but the eyes must be a warning. A woman with sharp features and a French accent murmured, tilting Brianna's chin up with a gloved finger. The transformation began with the hair. The soft, practical waves she had maintained for years were pulled back, brushed with a tension that felt like a challenge, and woven into an intricate, towering crown of braids that elongated her neck and exposed the sharp line of her jaw. Every stray hair was tamed, every soft edge sharpened. When they finished the makeup, Brianna stared at the mirror and didn't recognize the reflection. The good girl was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes shadowed in charcoal and lips the color of dried blood, looking like a deity of retribution. Then, they brought out the gown. It hung on a floating rack, a waterfall of heavy, liquid silk in a shade of emerald green so deep it bordered on black in the shadows. It was the color of ancient forests and cold envy. As they draped it over her, the fabric felt like a second skin, cool and impossibly expensive. The bodice was structured like a corseted armor, cinching her waist until her silhouette was a lethal hourglass, while the skirt flowed to the floor with a high slit that promised a glimpse of a weaponized heel with every step. "Diamonds are for starlets," the lead stylist said, opening a velvet-lined box. "For Ali, we use ice." She fastened a necklace of raw, pear-cut emeralds and platinum around Brianna's neck. The stones were heavy, a cold weight that sat against her collarbone like a reminder of her new husband's reach. They added matching drops to her ears and a ring that felt like a knuckle duster disguised as fine jewelry. Brianna stepped into a pair of black stiletto heels that added 4 inches to her height, forcing her to find a new center of gravity. She stood taller, her shoulders pinned back by the structure of the silk, her head held high by the weight of the braids. She looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt like the sun. The double doors of the dressing suite slid open. Lee Dong-hwan stood in the aperture, already dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame. He didn't say a word as his eyes traveled from the tips of her black heels to the emeralds at her throat. The silence stretched, thick with a tension that was no longer just about business. A slow, predatory satisfaction spread across his features. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet, until he was close enough that Brianna could smell the ozone and cedar that clung to him. He didn't touch her, he was too disciplined for that, but his gaze was a physical weight. "The strategist is finally dressed for the war," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "I don't feel like myself," Brianna whispered, though her voice didn't tremble. "On the contrary," Dong-hwan corrected, stepping even closer until he was a wall of charcoal silk in front of her. "You finally look like the woman who built Julian's empire. He kept you in beige because he was afraid of what would happen if the world saw you in green. He wanted a ghost. I wanted a queen." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, slim device, a secure comms link, and tucked it into a hidden pocket in the folds of her skirt. His fingers lingered for a second against her thigh, a brief spark of heat against the cool silk. "Julian is waiting in his boardroom," Dong-hwan said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He thinks he's about to celebrate the greatest deal of his life. He has no idea that the woman who made him is standing in my penthouse, ready to unmake him." Brianna looked at her reflection one last time. The woman in the mirror was beautiful, yes, but she was also terrifying. She was the Mafia's consort, a Lee, and a master strategist who had finally found a stage large enough for her ambitions. "Let's not keep him waiting," Brianna said, her voice sounding like a blade being unsheathed. "I have a severance package of my own to deliver." Dong-hwan offered his arm, his expression one of dark, unyielding pride. Flanked by the army of shadows waiting in the hallway, Brianna stepped out of the suite, the emerald silk whispering against the floor like a promise of rain. The housewife was dead. The war had officially begun. The restaurant, a glass-walled sanctuary of old-world privilege perched 40 floors above Midtown, was a place Brianna had once navigated with the quiet grace of a shadow. It was where Julian liked to hold court, where the waiters knew his vintage and the regular patrons knew to stay out of his light. Coming here alone was a tactical choice, a calculated baiting of the trap. Brianna sat at a central table, the emerald green silk of her gown spilling over the chair like liquid poison. She looked less like a diner and more like an apex predator waiting for the wind to shift. She sipped a glass of vintage cristal, the raw ice of her necklace catching the amber glow of the chandeliers. She didn't have to look for him. She felt the air in the room sour the moment Julian Reeves stepped through the gilded foyer. He was laughing, a boisterous, expansive sound that usually filled the room, with Skye Addison draped over his arm like a sequined trophy. But the laughter died the moment his eyes landed on the woman at the center of the room. He froze, his gaze raking over the sharp, braided crown of her hair, the lethal line of her jaw, and the sheer, unapologetic power radiating from her silhouette. He whispered something to Skye, who looked toward Brianna with a flash of annoyance that quickly turned into a sneer, and then he began to stride across the floor. He didn't walk like a man approaching an ex-wife. He walked like a landlord coming to collect an overdue debt. "Brianna," Julian said, his voice dropping into that low, paternalistic register he used when he wanted to remind her of her place. He didn't wait for an invitation. He leaned over the table, his hands gripping the back of the empty chair opposite her. "I have to say, the revenge look is a bit much, even for you. Where did you get the jewelry? Did you spend the entire settlement on a single night of cosplay?" Brianna didn't look up. She carefully set her glass down, the diamond and emerald ring on her finger clinking against the crystal with a sound like a distant bell. "Hello, Julian. You're late for your reservation. I assume Skye had trouble finding a dress that didn't look like a costume." Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He leaned in closer, invading her space, his scent of expensive cigar smoke and desperation suddenly cloying. "Listen to me very carefully. I don't know what kind of midlife crisis you're having, or whose credit card you're running up to play the part of a socialite, but you're making a scene. People are staring. You're embarrassing the Reeves name." "I'm not a Reeves, Julian," she said, her voice a cool, flat blade. "I thought we made that very clear in the library. I'm a write-off, remember? A legacy asset." "You're a child playing with fire," Julian hissed. He reached out, his hand moving to grip her upper arm. A familiar gesture of control he had used 1,000 times to steer her through crowded rooms. "We're leaving. Now. I'll have my driver take you to a hotel, and we can discuss how you're going to pay for this little stunt in the morning." His fingers were inches from her skin when the world went silent. Julian didn't see them move. No one did. It was as if the shadows of the restaurant had suddenly solidified into flesh and bone. Marcus and 3 of the charcoal-suited guards appeared in a perfect, suffocating semicircle around the table. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't shout. They simply stood there, for walls of coiled, military lethality that made the air in the room turn to ice. Marcus stepped forward, his scarred eyebrow twitching as he looked down at Julian's outstretched hand. He didn't touch Julian, but he leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carried more terror than a scream. "Remove your hand from the vicinity of Mrs. Lee," Marcus said. Julian flinched, his arm recoiling as if he had been burned. He looked at Marcus, then at the other 3 men, his eyes wide with a sudden, panicked realization. These weren't the rented security guards he was used to. These were men who had seen the bottom of the world and survived it. They stood with a stillness that was unnatural, their eyes unblinking, their hands resting at their sides with a readiness that suggested they could dismantle the room in seconds. "Who are you?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he looked back at Brianna. "Brianna, what is this? Who are these people?" Brianna finally looked up, her charcoal-shadowed eyes meeting his with a chilling lack of emotion. "They're my shadow, Julian. They're the vitality I've added to my portfolio." "Mrs. Lee," Julian repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked toward the foyer, where Skye was standing, looking confused and suddenly very small. "You married him?" "Lee Dong-hwan. You're insane. He's a butcher. He's a criminal. He's a man who understands the value of an asset," Brianna corrected. She stood up, her emerald silk whispering against the floor, her height boosted by the stilettos until she was looking Julian directly in the eye. "And unlike you, he doesn't believe in write-offs." One of the guards stepped closer to Julian, the sheer physical presence of the man forcing Julian to stumble backward. The entire restaurant was silent now, every patron watching the king of the city being reduced to a terrified interloper in a world he no longer controlled. "Julian," Brianna said, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "The Holloway merger is dead. The board received the forensic audit an hour ago. You're over-leveraged, you're underprotected, and you've just been served with a hostile takeover bid from Lee Global. Julian's face went pale, the bravado draining out of him until he looked like the small, desperate man he had been before Brianna had taught him how to lead. You did this. I told you, she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. I spent 10 years building your world. It took me less than 48 hours to figure out how to pull the thread that unravels it. She turned to Marcus, a ghost of a smile touching her blood-red lips. I'm finished here, Marcus. The air has become a bit stagnant. Of course, ma'am, Marcus said, bowing deeply. The guards parted, creating a path of absolute authority. Brianna walked through it, the emerald silk flowing behind her like a royal train. She didn't look back at Julian, who was left standing in the center of the room, surrounded by a vacuum of power he couldn't fill. She walked past a stunned Skye Addison without a single glance, stepping out of the restaurant and into the cold, clean night of the city she was finally beginning to own. As she stepped into the waiting black Mercedes, she saw Dong-hwan watching her from the shadows of the back seat. He didn't ask how it went. He simply reached out, his hand finding hers, his thumb tracing the emerald on her finger. The warning has been delivered, he said, his voice a low, satisfied rasp. It was only the beginning, Brianna replied. The rain had tapered off into a haunting, rhythmic drizzle that blurred the lights of the city into a sea of smoldering embers. Inside the Tribeca penthouse, the air was heavy with the scent of cedar, aged scotch, and the faint, lingering ozone of the earlier storm. Brianna stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her emerald gown a dark, shimmering skin that felt more natural now than the cashmere sweaters of her previous life. In the reflection of the glass, she saw Lee Dong-hwan. He had shed his tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the corded muscles of his neck and the ghost of a tattoo tracing the line of his collarbone. He was watching her, not with the cold calculation of a business partner, but with a gaze that felt like a physical weight against her spine. Julian's stock is already plummeting, Dong-hwan said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. The news of the forensic audit hit the wires 20 minutes ago. By the time the markets open tomorrow, his board will be looking for a head to put on a spike. You didn't just warn him, Brianna. You gutted him. Brianna turned away from the window, her movement fluid and deliberate. She walked toward the obsidian desk, picking up a heavy crystal tumbler and swirling the amber liquid inside. He made it easy. He was so convinced of my insignificance that he didn't even bother to change the encryption protocols on the secondary servers. He assumed I'd forgotten the password to the world I built. He assumed you were a housewife, Dong-hwan said, stepping into the light of the desk lamp. It's a common mistake men like Julian make. They confuse silence for submission. They think that because they are the ones shouting, they are the ones in control. He stopped only inches away from her. The height difference was more pronounced now that she had kicked off her stilettos, but Brianna didn't feel small. She felt charged, her pulse a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat in her throat. The intellectual thrill of the evening, the look on Julian's face when the vacuum of power swallowed him whole, had mutated into something darker and more visceral. You enjoyed it, Dong-hwan observed, his dark eyes searching hers. Watching him realize that he is a small man in a very large, very cold room. I enjoyed the precision of it, Brianna replied, her voice steady despite the heat radiating from him. For 10 years, I was the one who smoothed over his mistakes. I was the one who turned his blunders into victories. To be the one who finally let the blade fall. It was the first time in a decade I felt like I was breathing. Dong-hwan reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before his fingers found the emerald at her throat. His touch was cool, but it ignited a fire that made the silk of her gown feel like it was melting into her skin. I've known many ruthless people, Brianna. I've lived my life surrounded by them. But most are ruthless because they are broken. You are ruthless because you are complete. You see the world exactly as it is, and you aren't afraid to pull the trigger. Is that why you chose me? She whispered, the amber liquid in her glass trembling as he stepped even closer, effectively pinning her against the edge of the obsidian desk. I chose you because I wanted an equal, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a raw, dangerous sound. I wanted someone who could walk through the fire with me and not complain about the heat. But tonight I realized that you didn't just walk through it. You owned it. He leaned down, his breath a ghost of cedar and peat against her lips. The business arrangement, the cold, clinical contract they had signed in the gray light of morning, seemed like a relic from another lifetime. The theater of power had become a reality that was no longer just about Julian or the Holloway merger. It was about the two of them, two apex predators who had found a mirror in each other's ruthlessness. Brianna reached up, her fingers tangling in the silk of his tie, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. The good girl, who had spent years playing the peacemaker, was gone, replaced by a woman who hungered for the darkness he represented. She didn't fear the man who owned the shadows. She wanted to lead them with him. Julian called you a butcher, she murmured, her eyes locked onto his. I am, Dong-hwan admitted, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip with a lingering, possessive pressure. But I only cut away what is rotten. And I protect what is mine with a ferocity that would make a man like Julian weep. He kissed her then, not a gentle invitation, but a claim. It was a collision of hunger and respect, a breaking of the final boundary between the strategist and the boss. The heat was different now, no longer the cold fire of revenge, but something thick and intoxicating that promised a partnership far more dangerous than anything they had planned on paper. When they finally broke apart, the air in the study felt electric, the silence amplified by the heavy thud of their shared heartbeat. Dong-hwan's hand remained on her jaw, his gaze unyielding. The merger with Lee Global will be finalized by Friday, he said, the transition back to business seamless, yet his voice remained rough with desire. Julian will try to fight it, but he has no ground left to stand on. You've taken his board, his capital, and his dignity. He still has Skye, Brianna said, a ghost of a predatory smile touching her lips. Let him keep her. She's the anchor that will ensure he sinks to the bottom. Dong-hwan laughed, a low, genuine sound of appreciation that Brianna had never heard before. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. You really are Lee. You don't just win, Brianna. You erase the competition. He stood back, offering his hand once more, but this time it wasn't for a walk through a boardroom or a restaurant. It was a beckoning toward the deeper, more intimate shadows of the penthouse. Come, he said softly. The war can wait until morning. Tonight, we celebrate the fact that I finally found my match. Brianna took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. The emerald on her finger caught the dying light of the desk lamp, a green spark in the dark. As they walked out of the study together, she realized that Julian hadn't just lost a wife or a company. He had lost the only woman who could survive a man like Lee Dong-hwan. And in doing so, he had created a queen who was no longer content to stay in the shadows. The glow of the multiple monitors in Dong-hwan's private command center cast a cool, blue light across Brianna's face, highlighting the sharp, predatory lines of her new reality. For 10 years, she had meticulously built the fortress that was Reeves International, brick by brick and secret by secret. She knew where the mortar was thin and where the foundations had been poured with cheap, substandard ambition. Now, she was the one holding the sledgehammer. Julian always had a penchant for vanity projects, Brianna murmured, her fingers dancing across the haptic interface with a precision that made Dong-hwan go still beside her. He wanted the optics of a conglomerate, but he never had the patience for the infrastructure. He created a network of shell companies, Blue Horizon, Apex Logistics, Vanguard, to shuffle his over-leveraged debt. He calls it dynamic accounting. I call it a glass house. Dong-hwan watched her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burning with a dark, appreciative intensity. He had traded his tuxedo for a tailored black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful, tattooed forearms that had built a different kind of empire. He thinks his debt is invisible because it's buried under 4 layers of offshore subsidiaries, Dong-hwan said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He doesn't realize that in my world, there is no such thing as an invisible paper trail. Everything leaves a scent. He's using the Reeves family trust as collateral for a private loan from a bank in Zurich, Brianna explained, pulling up a series of encrypted ledger entries that Julian had assumed were unhackable. The loan is tied to the stock price. If the stock dips below $42, the bank has the right to call the loan immediately. Julian would have to liquidate his personal holdings just to stay afloat. He'd be bankrupt by sunset. Then we don't just buy the company, Dong-hwan said, a slow, lethal smile spreading across his features. We buy the debt. Brianna nodded, a cold, clinical thrill racing through her veins. I've already identified the primary holders of his short-term liabilities. They're nervous, Dong-hwan. They've seen the forensic audit reports I leaked to the SEC. They're looking for a way out. If Lee Global offers to buy their positions at a premium, they'll jump before Julian can even get his lawyers on the phone. The silent acquisition began with a series of surgical strikes. Dong-hwan's network of ghost companies, entities that existed only in the gray markets and the digital shadows, began to move. It wasn't a loud, aggressive raid that would alert the media. It was a quiet, suffocating squeeze. One by one, Julian's creditors were approached by men in charcoal suits with offers they couldn't refuse. One by one, the keys to Julian's kingdom were transferred into Dong-hwan's hands, and by extension, Brianna's. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a pale, sickly light through the rain, the data on the screens began to shift. The red lines representing Julian's control began to retreat, replaced by the steady, unrelenting green of Lee Global's creeping ownership. Julian was still in his bed, likely sleeping off the stress of the previous night's public humiliation, unaware that the floor beneath him had already been sold. He won't even know it happened until he tries to walk into his own office, Brianna said, her voice sounding like a blade being drawn across silk. He'll find that his key card doesn't work. He'll find that his accounts are frozen. He'll find that the man he thought was his successor is actually his landlord. Dong-hwan walked over to her, his hand finding the small of her back, the heat of his palm seeping through the silk of her robe. You did more than just find the holes in his armor, Brianna. You showed me how to unmake him without firing a single shot. This isn't just business. It's art. He wanted a younger model, she whispered, turning to face him, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her charcoal-shadowed eyes. He wanted someone who wouldn't ask questions, someone who would just smile for the cameras. He forgot that the woman behind the scenes is the one who knows where the bodies are buried. He's about to join them, Dong-hwan replied, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive loyalty. He leaned down, his lips brushing hers with a promise of more than just a corporate victory. The Reeves name dies today. From now on, the only empire that matters is ours. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the transformation they had just completed. Brianna wasn't the strategist who hid in the shadows anymore. She was the one who controlled them. As she looked out at the city, she didn't see Julian's world. She saw her own, a landscape of power and retribution that she had carved out with the help of the most dangerous man she had ever known. The war was no longer about a severance package or a broken heart. It was about total, absolute dominion. And for the first time in her life, Brianna Carter was exactly where she was meant to be. The emerald green silk was more than a dress. It was a suit of armor forged in the fires of a betrayal that Julian Reeves could never have survived. Standing before the triptych of floor-to-ceiling mirrors in the Tribeca penthouse, Brianna watched as the final pear-cut emerald was fastened at her throat, the cold platinum a stark contrast to the heat radiating from her skin. This was the night of the gala, the stage where the ghost of a supportive housewife would be exorcised by the arrival of a sovereign. Her hair, woven into a towering, intricate crown of braids, exposed the lethal line of a jaw that had been tightened by weeks of tactical warfare. Every stray hair had been tamed, every soft edge sharpened until she looked less like a guest and more like a deity of retribution. The good girl, who had spent a decade smoothing over Julian's blunders, was buried beneath layers of charcoal eyeshadow and lips the color of dried blood. Julian had once told her that she was his legacy asset, a piece of his past to be written off in favor of Skye Addison's shiny, shallow vitality. He had kept her in beige and shadows because he was terrified of what would happen if the world saw the brilliance that actually powered his throne. Tonight, he would see it. Tonight, the world would see the master strategist in the color of ancient forests and cold envy. A low, resonant rasp broke the silence of the dressing suite. "The strategist is finally dressed for the execution," Lee Dong-hwan said. He stood in the doorway, a wall of charcoal silk and lethal intent, his dark eyes raking over her with an expression of unyielding pride. He didn't offer a hollow compliment. In their world, respect was the only currency that mattered, and the look he gave her was worth more than any empty promise Julian had ever made. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet, and offered his arm. "Julian is already there," Dong-hwan murmured, his voice a low vibration against the shell of her braided crown. "He's holding court, telling anyone who will listen that the hostile takeover bid is a bluff. He thinks he still owns the air in that room." Brianna's fingers, adorned with a ring that felt like a knuckle duster disguised as fine jewelry, found the crook of his elbow. "He's forgotten that I taught him how to breathe," she replied, her voice sounding like a blade being unsheathed. "He doesn't realize that the air in that room belongs to the man standing next to me, and the woman he was stupid enough to discard." As they stepped out of the penthouse, flanked by Marcus and the silent army of charcoal-suited shadows, the elevator descent felt like a countdown. The black Mercedes was waiting, a sleek, armored predator idling in the rain. Inside, the scent of cedar and ozone wrapped around them, a sensory fortress against the city Brianna was about to reclaim. The gala at the plaza was a sea of old money and shallow reputations, but as the car pulled up to the curb, the atmosphere shifted. Brianna could see the flashbulbs through the tinted glass, a frantic, rhythmic strobe that heralded the arrival of something significant. Julian was inside, probably draped in the sequins of Skye Addison, blissfully unaware that his landlord had arrived to collect a decade of interest. Dong-hwan squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing the emerald on her finger. "Are you ready, Mrs. Lee?" Brianna looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She saw the emerald royalty she had become, the master strategist who had finally found a stage large enough for her ambitions. She saw a woman who no longer looked for approval, but for dominion. "Let's go," she said, her voice a cool, flat promise of rain. "I want to see the moment he realizes he's a small man in a very large, very cold room." The door opened, and the roar of the crowd was instantly silenced by the sheer, unapologetic power of their presence. Brianna stepped out, the emerald silk flowing behind her like a royal train, her head held high by the weight of the braids and the ice at her throat. She wasn't walking into a party. She was walking into her own coronation, and the man who had discarded her was about to learn that some write-offs are terminal. The gilded doors of the plaza's grand ballroom didn't merely open, they surrendered. As the heavy oak panels swung wide, the concentrated roar of New York's elite, a cacophony of clinking crystal and hollow laughter, was severed as if by a blade. The silence that followed was visceral, a vacuum created by the sudden shift in the room's gravitational pull. Brianna Lee stepped into the aperture, her hand resting with light, lethal grace on the charcoal silk of Lee Dong-hwan's arm. The emerald green gown she wore was no longer just a garment. It was a sovereign's declaration. The heavy silk clung to her silhouette before cascading into a train that whispered against the marble like a promise of rain, while the pear-cut emeralds at her throat pulsed with a cold, predatory light. Beside her, Dong-hwan stood as a portrait of absolute, unyielding authority. He didn't just occupy the space, he owned the air within it. Behind them, Marcus and a disciplined phalanx of charcoal-suited shadows followed in a silent V formation, their presence radiating a coiled lethality that forced the crowd to part like a retreating tide. Brianna didn't look at the faces of the socialites or the investors. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, her head held high by the weight of the braids and the ice-cold clarity of her new reality. Across the room, Julian Reeves was mid-sentence, his expansive gestures intended to project the image of a man in total control. Skye Addison clung to his arm, her sequined mini dress glittering under the chandeliers, her rehearsed smile fixed for the cameras. But as the silence rippled toward them, Julian's words died in his throat. He turned, the smug confidence on his face withering into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His complexion went from a flush of success to a sickly, mottled gray in a heartbeat. He looked at Brianna, the woman he had called a legacy asset, the wife he had discarded like a depreciated piece of equipment, and he didn't see a ghost. He saw a queen. Julian's hand shook, the champagne in his flute sloshing precariously. Brianna, he choked out, his voice cracking, sounding thin and brittle in the quieted hall. Brianna and Dong-hwan didn't stop until they were standing in the center of the orbit Julian had tried so hard to build. The contrast was devastating. Julian and Skye looked like new money, desperate for attention. Brianna and Dong-hwan looked like the power that decided who was allowed to breathe. Julian, Brianna said, her voice a cool, flat blade that carried to the furthest corners of the ballroom. Julian's gaze raked over her, the emeralds, the braided crown, the sharp, charcoal-shadowed eyes that held no trace of the woman who had once loved him. He pointed a trembling finger toward her, then toward the man at her side. "What the hell is this? What are you doing here? And who?" His voice trailed off as he took in the sheer, terrifying presence of Lee Dong-hwan. "You seem confused, Julian," Dong-hwan said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated with a dark, predatory satisfaction. He stepped forward, his hand possessive on the small of Brianna's back. "I believe you're already familiar with my wife, Brianna Lee." The name hit Julian like a physical blow. "Mrs. Lee?" he sputtered, his eyes bulging as he looked at the massive sapphire and diamond ring on Brianna's finger, the seal of her new empire. You married him? Do you even know who he is?" "Brianna, this is insane." Skye Addison tightened her grip on Julian's arm, her eyes wide with a mix of envy and dawning terror. "Julian, let's just go," she whispered, her voice sounding small and garish against the silence. But Julian couldn't move. He was staring at Brianna, searching for a glimmer of the good girl who had spent 10 years smoothing over his blunders. He found nothing. "You did this for revenge," he hissed, his fury finally bubbling to the surface, though it was tinged with desperation. "You married a butcher just to spite me. You're trying to ruin the Reeves name." "I am the Reeves name, Julian," Brianna replied, her voice steady and echoing with a chilling lack of emotion. "Everything you think you built, I architected. Everything you think you own, I secured. You told me it was time for a write-off. You told me Skye was the face of the future." She leaned in, the scent of cedar and ozone from Dong-hwan wrapping around her like a shield. "The future is here, Julian. And it doesn't include you." Dong-hwan raised his glass slightly toward Julian, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, possessive loyalty. "Thank you for your severance package, Julian. It allowed me to acquire the only asset in your portfolio that actually mattered. Your debt is being called in. Tomorrow, your board will realize that the man they trusted is nothing more than a hollow shell." Marcus stepped forward, his scarred eyebrow twitching as he stood between Julian and the couple. The sheer physical presence of the guards forced Julian to stumble backward, nearly tripping over Skye's train. The entire room was watching the king of the city being reduced to a panicked interloper. Julian looked around the ballroom, seeing the board members and investors he had been courting already turning their backs on him, their eyes fixed on the power radiating from Dong-hwan and his emerald-clad bride. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the foundation of his world. "Brianna, please," Julian started, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. But Brianna was already turning away. She didn't need to hear his apologies or his excuses. She had delivered her own severance package, and the look of pure, agonizing regret on Julian's face was the only interest she cared to collect. She walked toward the center of the dance floor with Dong-hwan, the emerald silk of her gown whispering a promise of total dominion. She wasn't the woman who had been dumped for a younger model. She was the woman who had married the shadows, and tonight, the city finally knew who its real queen was. The silence in the ballroom didn't just linger. It curdled, turning the air Julian Reeves breathed into something thick and toxic. He stood paralyzed, his hand trembling so violently that the champagne in his glass threatened to spill over the rim and stain his pristine white cuff. Across the few yards of polished marble that felt like a canyon, Brianna stood bathed in the amber glow of the chandeliers, her emerald green silk shimmering with a lethal luster. She wasn't looking at him with the fire of a woman scorned. She was looking at him with the chilling, clinical indifference of a creditor come to collect a debt. Beside Julian, Skye Addison's grip on his arm had tightened until her knuckles were as white as her sequins. She looked back and forth between the high-profile couples, her lower lip trembling. The vitality Julian had traded everything for was now just a mask of mounting terror. She was a face for a future that was evaporating in real time. Julian, a voice cut through the haze of his panic. It was Arthur Sterling, the chairman of the Reeves International board, a man Julian had spent months trying to impress. Julian turned toward him, desperate for a familiar anchor, but Arthur wasn't looking at him with his usual paternalistic approval. His gaze was fixed on Dong-hwan, his expression one of calculated, predatory interest. "Arthur, thank God," Julian managed to stammer, his voice sounding thin and desperate even to his own ears. "This is some kind of orchestrated stunt. Brianna is clearly out of her mind. And this man." Arthur didn't let him finish. He stepped past Julian as if he were a piece of discarded furniture, his hand extended toward Dong-hwan. "Mr. Lee, it's an honor. I was under the impression you didn't attend functions of this nature." "I make exceptions for significant acquisitions," Dong-hwan replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in Julian's very marrow. He didn't release Brianna's waist, his possessive hold a silent declaration that the most valuable asset in the room belonged to him. "And my wife felt it was time to finalize our business with the Reeves estate." The word estate hit Julian like a physical blow. It suggested a finality, a post-mortem on the empire he had spent a decade pretending he had built alone. He looked around the room, and for the first time, he saw the faces of his peers not as allies, but as scavengers. The board members he had courted, the investors he had lied to, and the socialites who had laughed at his jokes were already drifting away from him, their orbits shifting toward the new sun in the room. Julian's phone vibrated in his pocket, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that felt like a death rattle. He pulled it out with numb fingers, the screen illuminated with a flurry of notifications from his chief financial officer. Lee Global has acquired 51% of the logistics shares. The Zurich loan has been called. Arthur is calling for an emergency vote at dawn. The floor beneath Julian's feet seemed to tilt. He looked at the screen, then at Brianna, who was watching him with a faint, predatory smile touching her blood-red lips. In that moment, the realization finally punctured his arrogance. He had lost. He hadn't just lost the company. He had lost the reputation he had traded his soul to maintain. And he had lost the only person who had ever truly known how to save him from himself. He looked at Skye, who was now pulling away from him, her eyes darting toward the exit as if searching for a lifeboat. She was a younger model, a face for the cameras, a woman who knew how to smile, but had no idea how to survive a war. She couldn't read a ledger, she couldn't navigate a hostile board, and she certainly couldn't stand against a man like Dong-hwan. Julian had traded a master strategist for a trophy, and now the trophy was looking for a new shelf. "Brianna," Julian whispered, the name tasting like ash. He took a staggering step forward, ignoring the way Marcus and the charcoal-suited guards shifted into a wall of unyielding muscle. "Brianna, please. We can talk about this. The Holloway deal. I didn't know. You have to help me. You're the only one who knows the protocols." Brianna tilted her head, the emeralds at her throat flashing like the eyes of a serpent. "I told you, Julian. The protocols have changed. You wanted a write-off. You wanted to play with the big boys without your safety net." She leaned in, her voice a cool, flat promise that only he could hear. "This is what a write-off looks like, Julian. It's silent. It's total. And it's final." Julian reached out, his hand grasping for her emerald silk, a final, pathetic attempt to reclaim the woman who had been his shadow. But he never touched her. Marcus stepped into his path, the scarred eyebrow twitching as he looked down at Julian with a look of bored pity. He didn't have to say a word. The sheer physical presence of the Mafia's fist was enough to make Julian recoil, stumbling back until he nearly fell over a tray of abandoned champagne. The room began to move again, but it moved without him. Dong-hwan turned Brianna away, leading her toward the center of the dance floor as the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz. The elite of New York followed them, leaving Julian in a vacuum of power he could no longer fill. He stood in the center of the ballroom, a panicked bystander at his own execution. He watched the woman he had discarded glide across the floor in the arms of the most dangerous man in the city, her emerald train whispering a final goodbye against the marble. Julian Reeves was a ghost, a legacy asset whose time had officially expired, and as the lights of the gala blurred into a sea of cold, mocking stars, he realized the most bitter truth of all. He hadn't just lost his empire. He had lost the woman who had made him a king, and he would spend the rest of his life as a man who owned nothing but the crushing weight of his own regret.